Hello and welcome to JPod. This is a podcast on journalists and journalism. My name is Krishna Prasad and I'm coming to you from Mysore, the Mysore of Star of Mysore. Today is a significant day in the history of journalism in our beautiful city, in its long and glorious history of local journalism. For the first time in 43 years, Mysoreans will go to bed tonight without receiving and without reading a hard copy of the city's evening newspaper, Star of Mysore. When the announcement of the suspension of publication, the temporary suspension of publication came last evening, I could hear many on social media shout "good riddance" triumphantly, like they had achieved something huge in forcing its temporary closure. Like something good had happened to the world with a newspaper not appearing in its physical form. A well-known journalist sent me a direct message on Twitter with the words, "Glad it is gone." Such reactions, of course, were mostly from non-Mysoreans who do not know Mysore, or Mysore's place in Indian journalism, or Star of Mysore's place in the hearts of Mysoreans. In these polarized times, it seems as if we are not worried about sub-editors and artists and photographers and peons who will lose their jobs if a newspaper closes, even if temporarily, or vendors and delivery boys who will lose their commissions, or a city that will lose its voice even if for just a few days. It just seems to not matter anymore. All these negative reactions were, of course, in response to an Islamophobic editorial that the newspaper ran on April 6th on the Tablighi Jamaat issue. Most of them were reacting to and offering instant judgment on that editorial of Star of Mysore. The editorial was titled "Bad Apples in the Basket," and it advertised the hatred and bigotry that Indians educated in WhatsApp University have begun to wear like a sacred thread in New India. If you haven't followed the controversy, the offending line in the Star of Mysore editorial read, quote, "The nation is currently hosting an annoying 18% of its population self-identifying as rotten apples," unquote. Yes, not just an annoying 18%, but an annoying 18% self-identifying as rotten apples. We are all very wise in hindsight, but this much can be said safely. Even a Swayam Sevak, whose chief source of news is Republic, would have chosen his words more carefully than Star of Mysore did. The newspaper apologized 4 days later with what has also become the new normal in New India, which is a conditional apology. The paper admitted to a lapse in judgment. If it has heard the sentiments and feelings of our esteemed readers, Star of Mysore sincerely regrets and apologizes for the same, the apology read. If it has heard the sentiments, if it has heard the feelings of readers, those were the words Star of Mysore chose in its apology. Yes, indeed, the editorial had heard the sentiments and had heard the feelings of readers. So many agitated readers actually began asking their newspaper boys not to deliver the paper in the evening. Anger piled up on social media against the paper as social activists and politicians and opponents saw their chance. And a Bangalore-based group that wants ethical reporting in the media sent a legal notice of sorts to the paper. So on Sunday, the family-owned tabloid newspaper decided to suspend the print edition from Monday. The online edition will come out as usual, as will the paper's Kannada morning edition, Mysore Mitra. Star of Mysore can argue that the suspension of publication has nothing to do with the stupid editorial. Maybe, but the 15-day extension of the coronavirus lockdown has come in handy to cool the embers. As it is, Star of Mysore, like most newspapers, was suffering. Advertising and circulation revenues had fallen to near zero during the 21-day lockdown. And the paper, which produces a healthy 16 to 24 pages each day flush with local ads, was forced to publish a mere 8-page edition as shops and restaurants and other business establishments in Mysore remain shut as they are across the country. And on top of this, fears of contamination had affected the morning newspapers. And with Star of Mysore, which depends on its own network of vendors in the afternoon to distribute copies, the problem was even more compounded. Another 15 days of shutdown would have meant another 15 days of producing a skimpy edition with no ads. With newsprint and ink supplies being affected because of the lockdown, with distribution continuing to be a problem, I suspect Star of Mysore chose the easiest option before it. So in a manner of speaking, the prognosis that coronavirus would impact print media came true bang next door. But who would have thought that a successful, middle-aged, profitable publication like Star of Mysore would be among the first casualties? As the cheering on social media by non-readers and by non-Mysoreans rose, there was only one question in my mind, really. How would my mother have reacted if Star of Mysore had not come home today? Yes, my mother. My mother was Sharada Viswanath. She was a teacher for 36 years. She passed away last year. She was 87 years old. My mother had been an avid newspaper reader all her life. Whichever city she was in, she read half a dozen newspapers in English and Hindi and Kannada all day, every day. In Mysore, Star of Mysore would land at our doorstep at 4 p.m. She would read just a little with her evening cup of tea and then read the rest after a walk before she switched on the TV. In Delhi, where she read even the business newspapers, her day would not be complete without reading Star of Mysore, which came by post or courier and which I brought home from office. If she was on vacation with no access to Star of Mysore, she would ignore all the morning papers that had piled up when she was away, but would organize all the issues of Star of Mysore to read the next day. And in her last week in hospital, the common question she would ask me every evening actually, when we would drop by was, Star of Mysore Tandidya? Which is, have you brought Star of Mysore? So in short, for 42 years, my mother read Star of Mysore no matter what. So how would she have reacted to its suspension of publication suddenly? I don't know. But I can safely guess that she would not be celebrating. She would miss it immensely in a manner in which non-Mysoreans who are exulting today will not understand. Let me explain why. In all the comments and criticisms of Star of Mysore and its editorial on bad apples, there's an underlying feeling of pleasure at its plight, that it got what it deserved. Really? Like none of us have made mistakes in our lives before? Like none of us have said things we were not supposed to say? And in all the takedowns of Star of Mysore, there's also the strong charge that it was a Sangh Parivar mouthpiece and that the editorial only reflected that view. Maybe. But my mother was not a BJP supporter, not by a long shot. She could identify communal hatred from a mile. And when we went to Benares in 2017, she thought Narendra Modi's constituency was a joke. Yet, she unfailingly picked up Star of Mysore, not because of its politics or its stupid advocacy of all things RSS and BJP and Modi, but also because it fulfilled a vital function no other newspaper did. It told her something about her city which no other newspaper could. It told her what happened in the city corporation meeting that morning. It exposed how uranium was being enriched in our own backyard. It told her how a local politician had encroached a park, or a group had cleared a garden. It told her what had happened in Bangalore or the rest of India that very evening. It told her about a lady who had won the flower show competition, or the boy who had been picked up by Mumbai Indians for the IPL, or the club mate's husband who had passed away suddenly, or the latest celebrity visitor in town. It told her about a neighbor's daughter who became a World Bank chief economist, or the local boy who sang Jai Ho. You get the picture. You might say all this appears in all newspapers today. Maybe, but only off late. It was Star of Mysore which put the word hyper in hyper-local a long time back. If it was still useful to my mother, it was because it was able to do what it did better than the rest of the competition. It had the daily engagements of what was happening in town. It had advertisements that were of use to her. It had the columns written by people she could identify and relate with. So therefore, coronavirus has thrown a big question mark over print journalism. Just today we have heard of dozens of people being laid off by the Times of India and Quint and Economic Times and so on. But those are distant and unknown things. They may well have not existed for my mother beyond a point. To understand Star of Mysore's deep links with Mysoreans, I called K. Vijay Kumar, the Mysorean who headed the Karnataka Information and Publicity Department. He used the word attachment that local newspapers have in Mysore. The relationship between a Mysorean and the Star of Mysore, he said, is not like any other. It is not just the relationship for which you are billed at the end of the month with other newspapers. It goes deep, deep down. And to understand how deep it went, I had to call Gauri Satya. Gauri Satya ran a 2-page newspaper called Samachar, which he inherited from his father. It sold for 3 paise a copy when I was in school. As competition from Star of Mysore increased, Gauri Satya had to shut it down in 1999 in its 50th year of publication. He had other things to do, he had the world to travel. But Satya spoke of Mysore's long history with small newspapers, especially during the pre-independence movement. At one time, he said, there were 43 small newspapers in Mysore. The Maharaja of Mysore himself read one of them, Sadhvi, which was brought out by K. Venkatakrishnaya, which often actually took on the administration of the Maharaja and his Diwan. Once a visitor dropped in unannounced at the residence of the Diwan, the then Diwan, K. Sheshadri Iyer. He said he was from outside and wanted to meet interesting people in the kingdom. Sheshadri Iyer pointed at the bungalow opposite his own house and said, "You must go to that house. Tataya lives there. You will find him more interesting." Tataya was K. Venkatakrishnaya, the editor of Sadhvi. Not surprisingly, in Mysore, there is a statue of Tataya on the southern edge of the main palace. That anecdote in some way exemplifies Mysore's connection with local newspapers. The sense of ownership and participation that my mother and hundreds of mothers have. By no means is Star of Mysore the finished article. Not at all. Its design is ordinary. Its English even more so. Some days it's boring, many days it's exasperating, and often it is infuriating like it was on the day it printed that editorial last week. But it has done something the Times of India and Deccan Herald and the Telegraph have all tried but failed to do, which is to run a successful evening newspaper. Which is why, while it is good to hold Star of Mysore to account for its editorial and its strident majoritarianism, it is useful to step back and look at the deeper damage coronavirus is causing to local journalism. As a supremely profitable venture with near monopoly status, Star of Mysore will of course bounce back once the lockdown ends. Maybe it will lose a few readers, but its absence is something Mysoreans will not be able to take for too long. Certainly my mother wouldn't have. Thankfully, she was gone before Indian journalism could be reduced to this pass by a tiny virus and a gigantic ego. But at this time, we must look at all the other small newspapers and medium newspapers across the country which are in worse shape than Star of Mysore. That was J-Pod, and I thank you very much for listening.